Patton did not wear two revolvers because he was fearless. He wore them because once, his gun failed while the fight didn't. That single moment shattered a belief he never trusted again, that one perfect weapon is enough. Long before World War II turned him into a legend, Patton stood in a dusty Mexican courtyard with bullets slicing past his head and an empty revolver in his hand. He was trained, he was confident, he was ready. And yet, for a few seconds, he was completely exposed, reloading, counting heartbeats, hoping the enemy would miss. They almost didn't. From the outside, the ivory-handled revolvers looked like theater. A symbol, an affectation, style. But Patton knew better. Those two revolvers were not decoration. They were a refusal to trust a single solution ever again. A rejection of the idea that courage or skill alone could carry you through chaos. One weapon could go silent. One plan could collapse. The enemy would not wait. That belief followed him for the rest of his life. What people remember as arrogance was actually insurance. What looked excessive was deliberate redundancy. And what became his most famous image began as a reaction to vulnerability. This story is not about ivory grips or personal flair. It is about a man who learned that survival is not about perfection, but about having another option ready when the first one fails. Patton did not carry two revolvers to intimidate anyone. He carried them because once he trusted one, and it nearly got him killed. If you're interested in the moments history textbooks skip, the decisions that shaped entire wars, and the human flaws behind legendary commanders, consider subscribing. This channel explores the details that change how we understand history. The image is familiar. Two revolvers, ivory grips, a general who looked like he stepped out of a legend. For decades, people assumed the explanation was simple. Patton wore them because he wanted to be seen, because he believed in intimidation, because he understood symbolism and enjoyed cultivating fear. That explanation is comfortable and completely wrong. It assumes that confidence comes from appearance. That dominance comes from display. That war is won by the man who looks the most dangerous. Patton did not believe any of that. What he believed was far more unsettling. He believed that failure does not announce itself, that it arrives quietly, at the exact moment when confidence is highest. And that when it does, the only thing that matters is whether you prepared for it in advance. The revolvers were not the starting point of this belief. They were the result of it. To understand why Patton rejected the idea of a single solution, you have to strip away the myth and look at the fear underneath it. Not fear of death, not fear of combat, but fear of dependence. Dependence on one weapon, one plan, one assumption that everything will work as intended. Most people organize their thinking around best-case scenarios. Patton organized his around the moment when things stop working. This is the core paradox of his character. From the outside, he appeared reckless, aggressive, even theatrical. But beneath that surface was a man obsessed with control. Not control over others, but control over uncertainty. He understood that chaos cannot be eliminated, only managed. And management requires options. One option is not an option. It is a gamble. That belief shaped everything that followed. The revolvers were simply the most visible expression of a deeper rule. Never allow a single point of failure to decide your fate. Never let the collapse of one system freeze your ability to act. Never assume the enemy will pause while you recover. In Patton's mind, hesitation was not weakness. Dependency was. This framing matters because it reverses the way his image is usually interpreted. The ivory grips were not about ego, they were about memory. A reminder of what it feels like to be competent, trained, and still vulnerable. A reminder that skill alone does not protect you when the environment turns hostile. That lesson did not stay confined to weapons. Once internalized, it spread outward, shaping how Patton thought about movement, logistics, command, and time. If one supply route could be cut, he wanted two. If one advance could stall, he wanted another already moving. If one decision failed, he wanted the next one ready before the failure became visible. This is why his style of warfare felt overwhelming to both allies and enemies. It was not just speed or aggression. It was the absence of hesitation, the sense that even disruption did not slow him down. What looks like confidence was actually preparation, colliding with chaos and refusing to stop. Most commanders plan for success. Patton planned for breakdown. And that is the uncomfortable truth behind the legend. The man who looked obsessed with victory was actually obsessed with avoiding paralysis, with never being caught in the position of waiting, reloading, or hoping, with never reliving a moment where time stretched, options vanished, and survival depended on the enemy making a mistake. The revolvers symbolized a philosophy that would later define his command style. They were not there to scare anyone else. They were there to reassure him that he would never again face the fight with nothing left to do. This is why understanding Patton through image alone misses the point. The question is not why he wore two revolvers. The real question is why he never trusted just one. Because once you understand that, the rest of his decisions, on and off the battlefield, begin to make sense. The lesson Patton carried for the rest of his life did not come from doctrine, theory, or training manuals. It came from a mistake measured in seconds. The 14th of May, 1916, northern Mexico. Not a battlefield anyone remembers. Not a campaign taught in schools. Just a dusty ranch courtyard on the edge of the desert, where a young American officer was about to discover the cost of trusting a single weapon. At the time, George S. Patton was not a general. He was not famous. He was not even supposed to be there. The United States had sent troops across the Mexican border in what became known as the Punitive Expedition, a response to Pancho Villa's raid on Columbus, New Mexico. Officially, the mission was to capture or kill Villa. Unofficially, it was an experiment. Motor vehicles, aviation, a modern army testing itself in hostile terrain. Patton's cavalry unit was not selected for the operation. That should have been the end of it. Instead, Patton forced his way in. He pressed his superiors relentlessly until General John J. Pershing took him on as a personal aide. It was not a combat role. It was administrative. Patton accepted it anyway, believing proximity to action was better than none at all. But administration was never his goal. By the spring of 1916, the expedition was stagnating. Villa had disappeared into the mountains. The press back home was growing impatient. Pershing needed results. When intelligence surfaced that Julio Cardenas, Villa's most trusted lieutenant and commander of his elite guard, might be hiding near the ranch of San Miguelito, Patton saw his opening. What followed was not a grand offensive. It was a logistical errand. Patton was ordered to take 3 Dodge automobiles, a handful of soldiers, and civilian guides to purchase corn for the cavalry's horses. That was the mission. Buy corn, return to camp. But Patton understood the terrain. He recognized the location, and he made a decision that exceeded his orders. Instead of returning directly, he redirected the patrol towards San Miguelito. It was a gamble. If he was wrong, he would be disciplined for abandoning his task. If he was right, and the situation escalated, the consequences would be far worse. Patton did it anyway. The vehicles approached the ranch at speed, engines roaring, dust clouds trailing behind them. The plan was improvised but deliberate: block the exits, shock the occupants, prevent escape before anyone could mount a coordinated response. When Patton's car skidded to a halt near the main gate, the courtyard appeared empty. Then it exploded into motion. 3 mounted men burst from the far side of the compound, horses already at full gallop, rifles coming up as they charged directly toward him. The distance closed rapidly. 50 meters, 40, 30. Patton did not retreat. He stepped forward, raised his Colt single-action Army revolver, and fired. The first shot shattered the lead rider's arm. The second struck his horse. Man and animal collapsed together in a cloud of dust. The remaining riders fired as they passed, bullets cracking past Patton's position. He fired again. and again. Then the revolver went silent. 5 rounds. Empty. This was the moment. Patton dove for cover behind the corner of the building and began reloading. Single-action revolvers are unforgiving in moments like this. Each spent casing must be ejected, each fresh cartridge inserted by hand, one at a time. As he worked, the riders kept firing. 3 shots passed close enough that Patton later wrote he felt the air tear beside his head. There was no confusion about what was happening. He was not pinned down by lack of courage. He was pinned down by mechanics. His training did not matter. His confidence did not matter. His intent did not matter. The fight continued, while his weapon did not. Those seconds stretched unnaturally long. Reloading, exposing his hand, listening to bullets strike nearby, knowing that a single hit would end everything before it had truly begun. Eventually, he finished reloading and re-entered the fight. The remaining attackers were killed or captured. Julio Cardenas lay dead. The skirmish ended almost as quickly as it began. From the outside, it looked like a victory. Inside Patton's mind, it felt like something else entirely. Later, in letters and conversations, he returned to that instant again and again. Not the shooting, not the charge, not the outcome, the reload. The feeling of being active, yet powerless, of having no option but to wait while the enemy continued to act. He never forgot it. Patton ordered the bodies tied to the hoods of the automobiles and drove them back to headquarters at speed. It was brutal. It was theatrical. It was deliberate. The press seized on the imagery immediately. The young officer became a headline. Pershing promoted him on the spot. But the promotion was not the most important consequence of that day. The important consequence happened silently. Patton had experienced what he would later recognize as the most dangerous position a commander could be in. The moment when action is required but capability is temporarily absent. When the system you depend on reaches its limit before the situation does. He drew a conclusion that would shape everything that followed. Never again. Never again would he enter a fight without a second option already in place. Never again would he trust a single mechanism, a single plan, or a single assumption to carry him through chaos. The revolver had not failed. It had performed exactly as designed. The failure was assuming that design was sufficient. From that day forward, Patton treated redundancy not as excess, but as necessity. A second weapon was not indulgence. It was continuity. A way to ensure that action never stopped simply because one system reached its limit. This is where the image of Two Revolvers was born. Not from bravado, not from vanity, but from the memory of standing alive, trained, and helpless, waiting for a cylinder to fill while death closed the distance. Patton never intended to feel that again. What Patton carried out of that courtyard was not a story he liked to tell. It was a conclusion he never stopped applying. He did not frame the incident as bad luck. He did not blame the revolver. He did not see it as an anomaly. He treated it as evidence. The weapon had done exactly what it was built to do. It fired its allotted rounds, then stopped. The mistake was believing that this limitation could be ignored in the middle of chaos. From Patton's perspective, the lesson was simple and unforgiving. Systems fail on schedule. Combat does not. This distinction mattered. Most officers thought in terms of equipment performance. Patton began thinking in terms of continuity. What matters is not how well something works, but what happens the instant it stops working. From that moment forward, his decisions followed a different logic. He did not ask, "Is this enough?" He asked, "What happens when this is no longer enough?" The revolvers became the first visible expression of that shift. Carrying a second weapon was not a romantic gesture. It was a refusal to accept interruption. If one action ended, another had to begin immediately. No pause, no dead space, no waiting for circumstances to improve. Patton did not want options in reserve. He wanted options in motion. This is where his reputation begins to diverge from the reality beneath it. To observers, the ivory-handled revolvers looked like excess, They saw ornamentation, symbolism, ego. They saw a man curating an image. Patton saw something else entirely. He saw a buffer against paralysis. He understood something that many commanders never internalize. The most dangerous moment in any conflict is not when you are outmatched, but when you are temporarily incapable of acting. Inaction, even brief, invites collapse. The second revolver ensured that the act of fighting never depended on a single mechanical process. It transformed a moment of vulnerability into a moment of transition. Instead of reloading under fire, he would switch and continue. That logic soon expanded beyond the holster. Patton began applying the same principle to his thinking about time, movement, and decision-making. He became intolerant of plans that worked only under ideal conditions. Any plan that could fail in one way was already unacceptable. It had to be duplicated, overlapped, reinforced. This is the psychological pivot most accounts miss. Patton's aggression was not fueled by recklessness. It was fueled by impatience with fragility. He despised systems that required careful handling. He distrusted strategies that demanded perfect execution. Anything that relied on everything going right was, in his mind, already broken. The two revolvers were a personal rule turned into a habit. The habit became a mindset, and the mindset became doctrine. Years later, when Patton spoke about preparation, he rarely used language of caution. He did not say he wanted to be safe. He said he wanted to be unstoppable. That distinction mattered. Safety implies avoidance. Redundancy implies continuity. Patton was not trying to avoid danger. He was trying to deny it leverage. This also explains the theatrical elements that followed him throughout his career. The polished helmet, the riding crop, the rigid posture. These were not merely displays for others. They were reminders for himself, anchors that reinforced a state of readiness, a refusal to drift into complacency. The revolvers sat at the center of that ritual. One was familiar, proven, reliable. The other was insurance, stronger, reserved, unused unless needed. Together, they formed a system with no single failure point. As his career progressed, Patton sought out a second revolver that matched this philosophy, something more powerful, more decisive, not to replace the first, but to complement it. When he eventually acquired a .357 Magnum, he did not treat it as an upgrade. He treated it as reinforcement. Two tools, two paths forward. This was not paranoia. It was memory. He remembered the sound of empty chambers. He remembered the weight. He remembered the feeling of being temporarily irrelevant while the enemy continued to act. That memory became non-negotiable. In conversations with fellow officers, Patton often framed preparation as moral responsibility. To him, failing to anticipate breakdown was not an error of judgment. It was a failure of duty. Leaders did not earn the right to improvise under pressure unless they had first eliminated preventable points of collapse. This belief hardened with time. It made him demanding. It made him relentless. It made him difficult. But it also made him effective. By the time the world descended into global war, the rule forged in that Mexican courtyard was no longer personal. It was embedded in how Patton thought about command itself. A commander, in his view, existed to ensure momentum, to prevent pauses, to make sure that when one element stalled, another was already advancing. The two revolvers were the simplest expression of that worldview. They were small, visible, and easy to misunderstand. But they represented something far larger, the rejection of singular solutions in environments that punish delay. Patton never believed that courage alone could compensate for system failure. He believed courage mattered only if it could be sustained without interruption. And interruption, he knew, was inevitable. That is why the decision to carry two revolvers did not remain a personal quirk. It became a rule that would later govern how he moved armies, supplied them, and drove them forward at a pace that left enemies reeling and allies struggling to keep up. The man who once stood waiting for a cylinder to fill would not wait again. Not for a weapon, not for a plan, not for circumstances to improve. From that point on, Patton designed his world so that action never depended on a single, fragile mechanism. And that decision, made quietly and without ceremony, would shape everything that followed. When the Second World War began, Patton was no longer experimenting with ideas. He was executing convictions that had hardened over decades. The rule, forged in Mexico, had already escaped the confines of personal habit. By the time Patton commanded large formations, redundancy was no longer a preference. It was the organizing principle behind how he moved, fought, and sustained entire armies. What distinguished Patton from many of his contemporaries was not aggression alone. It was his refusal to build plans that could be stopped by a single disruption. He understood that modern war did not reward elegance. It rewarded resilience. Most commanders still thought in terms of decisive moments. Patton thought in terms of uninterrupted momentum. This is where the logic of Two Revolvers became something far larger. In North Africa, Sicily, and later across Europe, Patton consistently structured operations so that no single failure could paralyze progress. If one axis slowed, another was already advancing. If one unit stalled, another bypassed it. If one supply route faltered, alternatives were already functioning. Speed, in Patton's mind, was not about recklessness. It was about denying the enemy time to exploit friction. Friction was inevitable. Delay was optional. This philosophy clashed with more cautious approaches. Many Allied commanders prioritized consolidation, methodical advances, and tight control. Patton viewed excessive control as a liability. The more a system depended on perfect coordination, the more vulnerable it became under stress. He preferred systems that could survive disorder. This is why his offensives often appeared chaotic to observers. Units moved fast, lines bent, decisions were delegated aggressively. But beneath the apparent disorder was a deliberate structure designed to absorb shocks without stopping. Patton's armies did not need everything to work. They only needed something to keep working. This approach extended deeply into logistics. Supply, for Patton, was not a background function. It was the decisive factor. He understood that ammunition, fuel, and food were not resources to be managed conservatively, but flows that had to be maintained under pressure. Any pause in that flow translated directly into lost momentum. He therefore insisted on multiple supply routes, overlapping depots, and forward movement of logistical assets. Rather than wait for supplies to catch up, he pushed the system forward with the army. When one route was threatened or disrupted, others compensated without requiring command-level intervention. This redundancy reduced the need for hesitation. Patton despised hesitation. In his view, hesitation was not caution, it was exposure. The same logic governed his use of armor. Patton did not treat tanks as isolated spearheads dependent on flawless coordination. He used them as elements in layered advances. If one thrust met resistance, others pressed on. Resistance was bypassed, enveloped, or left behind to be dealt with later. This was not carelessness. It was prioritization. Patton believed that momentum created its own protection. A force that kept moving forced the enemy into constant reaction. Reaction, unlike initiative, compounds errors. The faster Patton moved, the more redundancy he generated. Every mile advanced created new options. Every breakthrough opened alternate routes. Every success reduced the enemy's ability to predict where pressure would appear next. This is why his campaigns often felt overwhelming. Not because they were perfectly planned, but because they were difficult to stop. The Two Revolvers logic scaled. At the individual level, it prevented a pause in combat. At the operational level, it prevented a pause in war. Critics often misunderstood this approach. They accused Patton of risking overextension, of moving too fast, of trusting improvisation over discipline. In some cases, they were correct. Patton's methods placed enormous strain on both men and machines. But Patton accepted that cost. To him, exhaustion was preferable to stagnation. A tired army could still act. A stalled army became a target. This philosophy also explains Patton's obsession with readiness. He demanded relentless training, not because he expected perfection, but because he expected failure. Training, in his mind, was not about mastering procedures. It was about ensuring that when procedures broke down, action continued. He trained his forces to move even when orders were unclear, to exploit opportunities without waiting for permission, to treat uncertainty as a condition, not an exception. This mindset unsettled superiors who valued predictability, but it produced results on the battlefield. Patton did not seek certainty. He sought continuity. The revolvers symbolized this better than any doctrinal statement ever could. They were a physical reminder that systems end, ammunition runs out, plans unravel, communication fails. And when that happens, what matters is not what you intended to do, but whether you can still act. Patton structured his command to answer that question affirmatively. Even his approach to command presence reflected this belief. He made himself visible, not simply to inspire, but to reduce decision latency. When leaders were present, decisions could be made immediately. When leaders were absent, delays multiplied. Presence, like redundancy, reduced paralysis. This is why Patton was rarely found behind static headquarters. He moved with the front. He absorbed information directly. He shortened the distance between problem and response. Every step he took forward reduced the number of assumptions his decisions depended on. In effect, he carried his second revolver into the architecture of command itself. By the time Allied forces raced across France after the Normandy breakout, this philosophy reached its most dramatic expression. Patton's Third Army advanced at a pace that stunned both allies and enemies. It exploited gaps without waiting for perfect alignment. It rerouted on the move. It fed itself through a constantly shifting network of supply lines. When fuel shortages threatened to halt progress, Patton did not simply wait. He reallocated, improvised, pressured, and maneuvered to keep at least part of his force moving. Partial motion was better than total pause. Always. This insistence on movement frustrated commanders who favored synchronization, but it also kept the enemy off balance. German forces, already strained, struggled to respond to an opponent that did not slow when plans deviated. Patton's war was not elegant. It was relentless. And it was built on a simple rule, learned years earlier. Never allow a single failure to stop you from acting. The irony is that this philosophy made Patton appear supremely confident, even arrogant. In reality, it was born from an acute awareness of vulnerability. He knew how fragile action could be. He had felt it personally, and he designed his method of war to deny that fragility any decisive role. The two revolvers were not superstition. They were structure. They represented a way of thinking that accepted failure as inevitable and planned around it instead of denying it. This acceptance freed Patton to move faster than those who still clung to the illusion of control. By the end of the war, the image of Patton with ivory-handled revolvers had become inseparable from his legend. But the real legacy lay elsewhere. It lay in an approach to command that valued continuity over certainty, redundancy over elegance, and motion over perfection. Patton did not win because he believed he could not fail. He won because he assumed failure would come and refused to let it stop him. The philosophy that made Patton effective also made him difficult. Redundancy, when pushed far enough, stops being a safeguard and becomes a burden. What begins as preparation slowly hardens into suspicion. Every pause feels dangerous. Every delay feels like a threat. Every sign of uncertainty demands immediate correction. Patton lived in that state. The rule that once protected him from paralysis began to shape his entire inner world. He did not simply plan for failure, he expected it. And expectation, repeated often enough, rewires how a person relates to others. Patton trusted systems less than people, and people less than motion. He demanded relentless pace, not because he enjoyed pressure, but because pressure prevented the conditions he feared most. Stagnation, hesitation, waiting, moments where the fight continued but action stopped. This mindset came with consequences. Subordinates often experienced his leadership as unforgiving. He pushed units past exhaustion. He drove commanders hard and publicly. Mistakes were not tolerated gently, because in Patton's mind, mistakes were not abstract. They were openings for collapse. To him, errors were not learning opportunities. They were vulnerabilities. This made Patton effective in combat, but corrosive in prolonged human relationships. The same redundancy that protected his operations eroded trust. Officers learned to anticipate his reactions rather than communicate uncertainty. Fear replaced dialogue. Compliance replaced initiative. Ironically, the man who despised paralysis sometimes created it in others. The constant demand for readiness also exacted a psychological toll on Patton himself. Always preparing for breakdown means never fully resting. Always anticipating failure means never fully trusting success. Victory becomes temporary. Relief becomes dangerous. Even moments of triumph carried tension. Patton could not easily enjoy pauses because pauses felt like exposure. When movement slowed, anxiety increased. When the system stabilized, he looked for the next weakness. This is the hidden cost of redundancy. It keeps you alive, but it keeps you alert. It protects you, but it never lets you relax. Patton's famous temper, his explosive reactions, and his inability to tolerate perceived softness all trace back to this internal pressure. He lived as though every delay contained the seed of disaster. In that frame of mind, patience felt irresponsible. This perspective also narrowed his emotional range. Compassion slowed things down. Reflection invited hesitation. Doubt created space for failure. Patton resisted all three. The revolvers, once symbols of continuity, became symbols of an unending readiness that left little room for vulnerability. He rarely allowed himself to be unguarded, even in private. The armor was psychological as much as tactical. Those closest to him noticed this strain. Patton oscillated between intense confidence and deep insecurity. He needed affirmation not to inflate his ego, but to stabilize his sense of control. Criticism cut deeply because it threatened the structure he had built to keep chaos at bay. When things went wrong, Patton reacted not with introspection, but with acceleration. Move faster, push harder, add another layer, another option, another safeguard. It worked, until it didn't. The pressure he exerted eventually produced public failures, incidents that exposed the limits of his approach. Moments where speed and aggression collided with political reality, human limits, and moral boundaries. Redundancy could not solve everything. The lesson learned in Mexico had protected Patton from mechanical failure, but it could not shield him from human complexity. People are not systems. They do not reset cleanly. They do not respond predictably under constant strain. Patton understood this intellectually. Emotionally, he never accepted it. The same instinct that made him an extraordinary commander made him a difficult man to live with and serve under. His obsession with preparation left little space for empathy. His fear of paralysis translated into intolerance for weakness. This is the paradox at the center of his legacy. The man who refused to depend on a single weapon depended heavily on a single way of thinking. Redundancy saved him from one kind of failure but exposed him to another. It made him formidable in motion but brittle in stillness, effective in crisis, uneasy in calm. By the end of the war, Patton's revolvers had become part of a carefully maintained image. But beneath that image was a man who never fully escaped the memory of waiting helplessly while danger closed in. That memory drove him forward. It also prevented him from slowing down. The question left behind is not whether Patton's philosophy worked. It clearly did. The question is what it cost, and whether the same rule that ensures survival in chaos can coexist with peace. Because redundancy, once internalized, does not turn itself off. In the end, the revolvers remained. They outlived the campaigns, the headlines, and even the war itself. Long after the sound of engines and artillery faded, the image of Patton with ivory-handled revolvers endured as a symbol. To many, it still represents confidence, dominance, and control. But symbols often survive longer than their meanings. What those revolvers truly represented was not power, but a response to vulnerability. They were not chosen in a moment of strength, but forged in a moment of exposure. They existed because once, preparation ran out before danger did. That distinction matters. Patton's philosophy was not built on the belief that he was unstoppable. It was built on the certainty that stoppage was inevitable. He did not plan for victory alone. He planned for interruption, for friction, for the moment when the obvious solution fails. The question his life leaves behind is not whether redundancy works. It does. The question is when it stops serving you. Preparation, taken far enough, can become a way of avoiding trust. Trust in systems, trust in people, trust in the idea that not every outcome can be controlled in advance. The same mindset that saves you in chaos can imprison you in peace. Patton never fully reconciled this tension. He carried his second revolver into every phase of his life, whether it was needed or not. The readiness that kept him alive also kept him guarded. The refusal to depend on a single option gradually narrowed his ability to accept stillness. There is something deeply human in that. Most people experience a moment when their first plan fails, when preparation collapses, when timing betrays them, when the world keeps moving while they are forced to wait. Some recover and move on. Others build their lives around ensuring it never happens again. Patton chose the second path. It made him exceptional. It also made him restless. His legacy invites a question that reaches beyond war and command, beyond weapons and history. It asks how much of our preparation is driven by clarity and how much by fear. At what point does having a backup stop being wisdom and start becoming obsession? At what point does readiness turn into refusal to rest? Patton believed that motion was safety, that continuity was survival. In the environments he faced, he was often right. But the world does not remain a battlefield forever. Eventually the noise fades, the urgency recedes, and what remains is the person who never learned how to lower the weapon. The revolvers, in that sense, tell a quieter story. They remind us that strength often begins with acknowledging vulnerability, but they also warn us that unresolved vulnerability can shape a life in ways that are difficult to escape. Patton did not wear two revolvers for style. He wore them because once he stood alive and capable, yet powerless to act. What he chose to build from that moment defined his greatness. What it cost him defines his humanity. And that is the tension history leaves us with. Not whether Patton was right, but whether we know when to stop preparing for the fight that no longer exists. If this story changed how you see Patton, you might want to explore more moments like this. We focus on the decisions that mattered, not the myths that survived. Subscribe if you want history told without shortcuts.